Dear Lynsey, dear Josh, heartily welcome to both of you and to this opening of the In Afghanistan exhibition. With this exhibition and the work of the late Tim Hetherington and Lynsey Addario, we wanted to let two of the most remarkable photographers of their generation meet in one exhibition. We wanted to create a meeting with two photographers that both have spent so much time in Afghanistan and at the same time have portrayed two so very different sides of the Afghan society. A meeting along masculine and feminine, military and civilian dimensions. And also a meeting between those who were born there and those who were airborne there. When we started planning this exhibition, we envisaged an opening and an artist talk that were both you, Lynsey, and Tim would be here. And we deeply regret that Tim is not with us anymore. Josh, I wanted to start asking you, since you were Tim's assignment editor, and you worked with him for so many years, it's good to have you here.
Thank you.
How would you describe Tim, and how did you get to know him?
Well, as you say, I'm the assignments editor at Panos Pictures, where I've been for 5 years now. And in that time, I worked very closely with Tim on his Liberia work, once we got it to book stage and exhibition stage, and then later with his Afghan work. It's hard to talk about a friend who has passed, and it fills me with great sadness that I am sitting here today instead of him, because I know he'd be very, very proud to be part of this great exhibition, as he is. But he was a wonderful human being, which is, I think shines through in his photographs from Afghanistan and from Liberia and from Nigeria. He had a way with people. People would let him into their lives in a way that was quite extraordinary. You can see that, I think, in all of the pictures, especially with this set here that's on show. He was part of this battalion. He didn't pick up a gun, he had a camera, but they trusted him and he trusted those men in a way that really I've not seen ever before. And he had a way of he wasn't just interesting, as all photojournalists and photographers and journalists tend to be, but he was interested. He would sit and listen to your stories. He would listen to me when I told him about anything that I was doing, personal projects or other people. He always had time, especially for young photojournalists, people that were coming up. And I know, especially this time in Libya last year, Guy Martin, who was another Panos photographer, we were thrilled when we heard that Guy was, together with Tim and Chris. It filled us with great confidence that this very young photographer, 28 years old, was going to be, with Tim, and obviously it ended tragically. But more than being such a talented and dedicated photojournalist, he was an amazing human being, and I say that with all sincerity.
Thank you. I think you also called him a people photographer.
Yes.
And we'll come back to that later. I think, Lynsey, heartily welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
So good to have you here.
Thank you.
I believe many of us wonder, did you ever meet Tim?
I did in 2007. I was in the Korangal Valley for on and off for 2 months, and Tim and I overlapped, and we first met at a very small outpost on the side of a mountain. And I remember I was sitting there and covered in dirt, and it was freezing cold, and it was just a pretty miserable place overall. And Tim walks up, and he's this very handsome, striking, intelligent, charismatic guy. And I thought, who is this? And he walked up, and we started talking. And unlike many photographers who are war photographers, he wasn't macho, and he wasn't arrogant. He wasn't narcissistic. He was just very gentle and very intelligent and very articulate, and so many things that you don't find in the field, and where people are really putting on this tough air about them. And so for weeks we spent a lot of time together on this outpost, talking and just catching up and talking about our philosophies about photography and where we wanted to go with our careers. And I left for a bit and came back in time for this very big operation called Rock Avalanche that the military had been building up to for months. And it was a battalion-wide operation that would last for 6 days of walking through the mountains. And I think it was on the 5th day, we were ambushed. And we were ambushed from 3 sides by the Taliban, and there were bullets coming from every direction. And when the ambush happened, I had been looking for a place actually to go to the bathroom, and we were on the side of a mountain, so I was looking for cover, and I was all alone. And I rolled down the mountain to get to where the other photographers were to try and meet up with my colleagues. And I remember there was this moment of panic when bullets are coming at you from every direction. And when I raised my head to find a place to hide, to seek cover, and there was a little tree about this wide that 4 of us were hiding behind, which didn't make any sense at all. And so I lied flat on the ground, and I'm flat on the ground, and I haven't even thought of taking pictures. The only thing I thought about was trying to stay alive. And I'm lying on the ground, and something inside of me says, you have to take pictures, you're here to document. So I raised myself up, and Tim was standing up in the middle of this gun battle, standing up totally still, just photographing and filming. And I thought to myself, I am the worst war photographer in the world. And that's the image I remember of Tim, and I won't forget.
Thank you. I think we'll also talk a little bit later about your philosophy of photography. Sure. But it seems to me that you and Tim shared very much of the same ideas in that respect as well. But if we take just a few steps back in time, sure. Lynsey, did you always want to be a photographer? How come that you ended up
I never wanted to be a photographer. I studied international relations and thought I would be working at the UN or doing something maybe as a translator. Or I never realized that a photojournalist was the perfect marriage of a creative profession and a thinking profession, and something that could really take an intellectual side and a creative side. And so when I realized that, it became this great epiphany, and that's when I decided in 1996 to dedicate my life to this. And I started out in Argentina. I flew there to learn Spanish and started photographing. And of course, I have never studied photography, so no one would give me a job. And I was incredibly persistent going into the local newspaper. And then I moved back to New York and was working in New York for the Associated Press. I went in and I just kept bringing them pictures every day until they basically couldn't turn me away, because it was very clear that I was not going to give up. And at that time in New York, I spent a lot of time at the gym, and I was reading John Burns's articles from Afghanistan under the Taliban on the Stairmaster. And I remember thinking, I want to go to this place and see how these women are living, because there were all these very dramatic articles about women living under the Taliban and the oppression. And so in 2000, I moved to India, and I tried to make a career as an international photojournalist. And in 2000, I was renting a room from another journalist. I was dirt poor. And he went to Afghanistan for Dow Jones. And he came back and he said, you should go photograph women living in Afghanistan. You're a woman. You can get access to them. You should go. And I said, okay. So I just saved my money, and I sent a few emails, and I got a visa, and I went. And I never once thought about the danger. I thought about only being able to go there and to document how women were living under the Taliban. And that was in May of 2000, and I've returned almost every year since then to continue photographing.
Thank you so much for not giving up. And I think even the first time you were there with Taliban, it wasn't allowed to make photos at all.
It was illegal at that time to photograph. And so I carried my camera in a little bag, and I was shrouded up. I didn't wear a burqa, but I was very well covered. You could only see my eyes. And every so often I would take out my camera quickly and put it back in the bag after taking a photo. But I had one document from the Taliban that they gave me that enabled me to photograph inanimate objects. So I was only allowed to photograph buildings. No animals, no people, just buildings. And so I would just run around with that little piece of paper and my camera in a bag, and that's how I started.
in that sense, it has been a development, but there are still challenges, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that too. But I just wanted to ask also about Tim, because he didn't set out as a photographer either, did he?
No, well, I mean, he, like Lynsey said, he was a very articulate, well-educated Oxford graduate, and it was only later that he went back to study photography in the UK. And I think that grounding outside of photography and outside of kind of the visual arts gave him a very different perspective when he approached his work. He always approached it with an awful lot of thought. Every image that he made had to mean something, it had to say something, and he worked very hard for a long time, I think, to develop his own visual language for saying something. You know, everything had to, you know, he had to have something to say before he was going to go to a place. So whether he was in the Niger Delta or in Liberia, it wasn't enough, I don't think, for him to simply witness and to record the events as they unfolded in front of him. He wanted to be confident that he was actually adding to the debate, that he was actually saying something with his images. And I think with this work, and certainly with the Liberia work, you see that very strongly, that they're not your standard war frontline works of photography. They go off-piste slightly, and they delve into areas of the human condition and human engagement in conflict that are unlike a lot of other photojournalism that's out there. And in fact, he wouldn't call himself a photojournalist.
No, because he worked with, you talked about his visual language.
Yes.
Actually, he worked not only with photography, but also with film.
Yeah, absolutely. He worked with film, and also, as his kind of career developed, he started working a lot more with not just with film, but with audio. And what you see in the Sleeping Soldiers part of the exhibit is an extremely important part of where Tim, I think, was going in his career photographically. He was combining video and stills and audio in a way that was really pushing the boundaries of what journalism, photography, visual arts could say about conflict situations such as Afghanistan. And also, I very much recommend getting hold of his film diary, which he made, well, over the course of 10 years, really, but it's his visual diary of all of the places that he was working in over the last decade or so.
Yes.
And it's quite extraordinary.
And we will also be screening his film Restrepo that he made with Sebastian Younger at 10 o'clock, and also tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
So we definitely recommend that one.
Absolutely, and that was a very important part of this time that he spent in Afghanistan. Like very quickly, it developed from what was on the surface perhaps quite a simple, you know, pictures and words assignment for Vanity Fair. And after his second trip out there, staying with this one single platoon, it turned into something a lot more powerful, and they started filming, him and Sebastian. And I think Restrepo really is one of the most unique and powerful pieces of film, reportage, documentary, whatever you want to call it, that has come out of this conflict in Afghanistan. So I highly recommend everyone to see it while it's on.
Yes. Lynsey, turning back a little bit to Afghanistan, and you said you have been there so many times. Could you say a few words about this series? How did it all start, the Wave Rebellion?
Over the years, I've photographed women, but not exclusively women. I've also photographed a lot of the military and civilian casualties and the toll that the war has taken on people in general. And in 2009, National Geographic, who I work with quite often, came to me and said, "We want you to do a story in Afghanistan." And originally the story was supposed to be something else, and it wasn't clearly defined. And we were having discussions with the editors. And the way National Geographic works is that you have pitch meetings where you have many people on the phone, basically the entire masthead, and then you have the photographer and writer. So we had this pitch meeting, and it was during elections in 2009 of President Karzai. And so I was working, 15-hour days for the New York Times, and then I had to come home and have these pitch meetings, and I was exhausted. And so we were having one of these meetings, and it wasn't really going anywhere. And it was very clear that the story wasn't being sold to the editor-in-chief. And the editor-in-chief just stopped the conversation, and he said, "Lynsey, if you could do any story in Afghanistan and have an unlimited budget, what would it be? And I said I would photograph women, and I would try to photograph them in the most real way that I could. It's a very difficult subject. I don't know if I can do it because it's very hard to get access, and the Afghan women here can talk about that. But I said I'd like to try. And so the next week they came back and they gave me this assignment.
And I think we can all tell that you do it really in the real way, and also in one way it's this very wide perspective, but also it's a very intimate focus, so to say. And looking at your photos, we have asked ourselves, how do you kind of find the stories? How do you find the women? And how do you establish trust with them?
I think a lot of the stories I had in my head because of the experiences I've had over the years. So I knew more or less the things I wanted to include. Of course, while I was photographing, I stumbled on other stories, and so I would, if I felt they were an important thing to include, I would. But over the years, I established contacts, and especially with women, doing different stories. And so I had to come up with sort of a blueprint of what I wanted to photograph, and that's basically what I did. I made 4 or 5 trips over the course of this assignment, and every trip I had sort of a list of things I wanted to try and focus on. But every day I would wake up, and if I was able to make one frame with the permission of the woman in the photo, her father, her husband, her brother. I had to get permission from every single male member in the family and the women. It was a miracle for me, and it really took. Sometimes I would spend 5 days photographing one woman, and I had her permission and everyone in her family's permission, and they would change their mind, and I had to throw away the pictures because you cannot. Afghanistan is a place where if people do not agree to have their image published, you can't publish them because you can get that woman killed. So it was very important for me to respect that and to make sure I went through all of the hoops in order to take these pictures without jeopardizing anyone's life.
Do you think, would it have been possible for a man to do the same, or you have to be a woman photographer, so to say?
I think it would have been very, very, very difficult. I mean, if not impossible. It's a society that's very segregated, and some of these images are incredibly intimate. Of course, the images that are taken in public places, yes, a man could shoot. But some of the very intimate ones, I think it would be hard because a lot of these women, I spent a lot of time with their families in their homes. That's something a male can't do. So it took a long time getting the trust of many of the women in the photographs and the trust of their families.
Talking about intimate situations, turning a little bit back to infidel. Could you tell us what's the story behind the infidel? How did it come about, and maybe also if you could explain the title?
Well, the title I think is quite simple. The infidel was the name that the soldiers in the Korangal Valley were called by the enemy, Taliban fighters. They would hear it on the radio. And they would, they reappropriated it, and as the conflict grew on, they decided that they were going to start tattooing it across their chests, and some of them did that. I think, as I said, this body of work, the book Infidel, and this exhibition installation started as an assignment for Vanity Fair, and with these initial pictures from that assignment, Tim won the World Press Photo in 2008, but as him and Sebastian were spending more and more time with this single platoon, part of a battle company, they became, extremely close to the men that were part of this platoon in a very, very unique way, to the point where I think Tim decided to almost turn his camera away from the conflict itself, from the images of the firefights. The initial assignments, the 2 trips he did out there, were very much focused, as they would be, on the fighting, on the conflict. But as him and Sebastian spent more and more time there, they became interested, I think, in the people. Tim always talked about being interested in the machinery of war on a very kind of basic level, like the guns and the ammo and the things that kind of young men sort of in part at least, go to war for. But that very quickly changed in his mind, and the machinery of war became these young men. And these really are the men that are the nuts and bolts of these conflicts. And their relationships between each other and as a unit is really what I think fascinated Tim. And you can see that also with his Liberia work and also with his work in Niger Delta, that and Lise said it as well, very well, that he was interested in the humanity, in the people that made these conflicts what they were.
Yes, and I read also that, or he stated in interviews that in the Korangal Valley, he didn't want only to be physically embedded, but also emotionally embedded. So it was actually his explicit choice.
Yes. Well, I mean, he was left, I think, with relatively little choice when it came to that. And I think that very quickly became apparent that, he was, his life and Sebastian's life were in these guys' hands. And similarly, vice versa. If Tim or Sebastian acted in a way that was foolish or inappropriate, then they would put the lives of their friends, the platoon would also be at risk. So they very quickly had to learn how to act like a soldier, how to prepare like a soldier. I asked him once, when he was doing a talk of the exhibition, when this exhibition first appeared in London in Photo 8 Gallery, in a very similar format to this, I asked him if the outpost had been overrun, what would you have done? He averted the question very professionally and said, luckily that never happened. But, I certainly feel, and, I may be wrong in this, but my feeling is he would have picked up a gun and fought beside those guys because that was how close they were. They were like brothers.
Lynsey, you also have the experience with being embedded. You have worked, as you said, a lot as a war photographer. In this exhibition, you figure more as a concerned photographer, and you seem to have these two dimensions in your work, war photography and also social and political issues. Is that a rare combination? I think...
I don't know if it's rare. I think photographers evolve and they change over time, and sometimes they do war more consistently, and then sometimes they step back and do other stories. I think certainly with the deaths of Tim and Chris, many of us have really stepped back and reevaluated and decided that maybe it's time to focus a little bit on the periphery, or on things, other issues that concern us, or other things that just aren't so much in combat, because it really took a toll on many of us. And so I think there are times, and there have been times in my life, I certainly have spent most of the last 10 years photographing war, but in between those assignments I always tried to do something different and something like this.
And what will you be working, or are you working on something now? I know you have this very small baby with you, 6 weeks, so I know what you're doing probably.
Not right now.
But how do you foresee the future? Do you have any specific plans that you like to share? Or is
in
it
April, I'll
secret,
go back to work. I have an assignment for National Geographic, so I'll probably start in April.
Yeah. And do you think you will travel back to Afghanistan? How do you perceive the future for the Afghan women in Afghanistan?
I think that's up to them. I think the Afghan women have to determine their futures, and I think, I think there's a long road ahead, and I hope that you continue to gain ground. But it is a very difficult culture to move forward in. Yeah.
Liz, she talked about the role of the photojournalists and the fact that you ask us to see. And you tell certain stories the whole way without giving all the answers. How do you look upon your own role as a photojournalist?
I mean, for me, I'm just a messenger, basically. I mean, I look at myself as I choose stories, I research stories, I spend a lot of time deciding where to go, and I go to a certain place, and I try and just tell the most objective story I can, get access to as many different sides of the story I can, and the most important part is to get it published, because if a story isn't seen, it doesn't mean anything. So for me, I've been very lucky to have the New York Times, National Geographic, Time, and Newsweek, very big publications, publish my work. But without them, I couldn't do anything, because it really wouldn't make a difference in society at all if no one saw it. So for me, it's a lengthy process of choosing a story and researching it, getting access, and then getting it published. But the people most responsible probably for my work are my translators and drivers and people in the field who help me get access to the people in their countries.
Being a messenger, I believe Tim said I'm a witness. And he also said that as a war reporter, I act as a portal or as a kind of doorway for the audience to enter into a political discussion.
Very true.
And to us, this is also part of the reason why we selected these two series. And we hope that it will spur reflection and discussion, and I'm sure it will. And I just want to round off here now, because we will move further on. But Lynsey and Josh, thank you again for sharing your insights and your reflections with us. Thank you.